and welcome to Facility Resilience, the podcast where we cover all things facility design, operation, and maintenance, in addition to resilience and business continuity strategies. I'm your host, Jennifer Getz, and today I'm joined by EJ Miller, a business continuity analyst with corporate and university experience. Today, we will be discussing what happens when a crime is committed at a facility and how executives and managers should respond. So, EJ, it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast today. If a violent attack takes place in a facility or within the outside perimeter, first and foremost, the priority is getting everyone in the building and the surrounding area to safety. But what happens after the perpetrator is apprehended? What is the facility management team's role in the immediate aftermath of a violent incident?
Well, good morning, Jim. So this is a typical topic to talk about, and it is happening way too often. I think that we have watched this dynamic expand and explode for a variety of reasons that we don't really understand. And I think that one of the things that we do have to consider with facility management is the responsibilities and the expectations that people have of that team. Sometimes the expectations are much higher than they even anticipate. The key, obviously, is to start with providing support to the incident commander. And we understand that from a structural perspective, but that really means by being the experts on what is needed in that building or that area, what the purpose is of that building or that area, that location, and then also knowing the services that are utilized in that building or that area. Now, the reason I keep saying area also is because sometimes it's not just within a building, the perimeter, and sometimes things can flow out into areas such as parking lots or grounds maintenance areas. Every facility has those key things that they look to, such as their heat and air systems, their waters, their utilities, but they also need to know not only those resources and where they come from, but also the layout of the buildings to include typically maps, the materials that are within buildings. And one of the key responsibilities is that facilities management has to be immediately involved in order to provide what I would call that proactive experience. So being prepared to help and guide some responses and needs, but not always knowing exactly what's going to be anticipated, and understanding that the incident commander may throw some things out and think that something needs to happen, but you have to be able to be the expert and stand up, kind of anticipate that, know what the capabilities of the building or the area are. No, hey, we can't bring in that type of equipment, or the sidewalks won't support that, or the building doesn't have the ability to do that. So I think that their first thing is to make sure they're supporting the incident, but that's really through expertise and knowledge and being able to step back and say, hold on, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, but here's why. And also being willing to look at the fact that there may need to be alternatives that you haven't thought of in the past.
You mentioned there being different expectations. What are some common expectations that you think they might not recognize right away?
Well, some of the things we've actually experienced in the locations that have had incidents is the police responders may have an expectation or want to handle a crime scene a certain way. Fire response may have a certain direction that they want to go with it. And part of what you have to look at is that unified command, understanding what's going on from the immediate emergency response, and then having to follow through with what that crisis response looks like. The emergency response is always quick. It's always about life. It's always about safety. The crisis side of it is where you have to kick in and understand that those things you may be asked to do from the different types of responders may sometimes conflict with what you know that the services that are available to you. And part of what you have to also consider is if it has become a crime scene, then you may need to work with other units, such as a crime scene unit, a medical examiner. They may need to preserve evidence in certain ways, and they may need your expertise in helping to preserve that so that maybe not only someone's not coming into the building, but also you're controlling the heat and air systems, you're controlling, the flow of the air as it comes through a building. If someone may have something going on with water damage and they need you to quickly get water shut off so that it doesn't, contaminate a crime scene. And that's not something that you always think about immediately. There are pieces of it that really have to go back to saying, okay, based on the incident, the expectations are, and then kind of walk through those, because we have found conflicting expectations depending on what that response team is, whether it's police, fire, medical, everyone kind of has their priority. And one of the challenges for facilities management is to be that guide, that coordinator of making sure what can the building accommodate, what can the space accommodate, and then how do you handle the response capabilities?
Yes, absolutely. So how can the facility management team and facility executives work hand in hand with law enforcement after these kind of events? I know you mentioned altering temperature for certain rooms in a crime scene, but do you have any recommendations on how to best approach communicating and working with law enforcement during a process like this?
I would suggest that the facilities management team be easily identifiable with badges. Vests are actually also a good idea, so there's no confusion as to who the facilities management team is. Also, being able to have someone who's willing to stand up and support the needs and be somebody who's not intimidated and willing to speak to law enforcement, willing to speak to the crime scene unit, willing to speak to the medical examiner or the fire department, or it could be a chemical issue and maybe you're needing to deal with chemical engineers and response teams. So that person from facilities management being willing to ask the questions regarding the work environment needs, such as temperatures within buildings. Do you need us to help control airflow? Do you need the temperature set at a certain level? Also, depending on damage that's been done to a facility, you also sometimes have to look at the exterior. Do you need us to put maybe plywood immediately on some broken glass, but we can only do it after the crime scene unit is finished? Well, there may be water elements or storms outside, so your facilities team may have to step up and say, while we can't touch that part of the building, can we help close off the perimeter? Do we have the ability to bring maybe a temporary wall up that we can establish on the outside without interfering with the crime scene that may be on the inside of the building? We also could consider that the facilities management team might be able to step up and say, well, we know that you need some privacy. This is a much larger area. We have some temporary walls we can bring over and be able to establish a perimeter so that they can help block off certain areas, because sometimes that has been an issue. Sometimes that can be done easily with some fencing, and sometimes they actually need a little more solid protection to help with what's going on behind the scenes.
So you just went through a couple different ways facility management teams would need to get involved to help support and assist law enforcement. During this process, what are some mistakes facilities teams might make, and how can they prepare ahead of time to prevent these kinds of mistakes from occurring?
Well, those are great questions. The challenge is not everyone knows what they are going to need. And I think that sometimes we can have, I would say, some misconceptions. And one of those is basically that we would expect that the incident commander will always know everything to ask for and exactly when they need it, because they won't. The incident commander has to respond to what is going on, and there is an ebb and flow. And because they find something out, they may need to change a different direction. Because the incident takes on a new direction, then you may have to introduce more people into the command. I would have to say facilities management really needs to be proactive and responsive. And they also need to have people available, believe it or not, usually 24/7 during and after an incident. Sometimes time is critical, and sometimes decisions or thoughts about how to handle something may not be the best thing for the building or the grounds. I think the other thing that facilities management has to be willing to be firm when providing educated information when requests come in. And of course, the challenge is to always be flexible. If your actual facility management team has never dealt with this type of issue, you need to be willing to say so. And they also need to be willing to have other experts and resources available. While we have experts we've got some really great people on our facilities management teams. They have got skill sets that are really critical, and some people are really, really good in areas, and we need to know that. But I think the other thing that we have to sometimes step back on and say, you know what, we've never dealt with this type of situation, or we've never had this type of response. So I think that the other thing is that you can't always assume that the skill set of your facilities management team members and their abilities are always going to match the crisis. And what I mean by that is sometimes you really need to train ahead of time. You need to make sure that your staff is trained and confident in their daily responsibilities. But I also think you need to take those training, the scenarios, those exercises, be it a tabletop exercise, be it a functional exercise. Know the ways and opportunities that you can train with your team members, but also know the skill set, find the weaknesses. If you do a tabletop exercise exercise or a scenario or a training and you throw out questions and every single question gets an answer, then you've kind of failed your team, because what you really want them to do is to think outside the box. You need to research some of those hard things, the hard decisions. I will give you what I hope is a good example. If you've never dealt with a body or bodies or contamination of liquids within a building from a crime scene, one of the things that your facilities team members need to learn about is they need to learn about crime scene prevention. And you can get information from the police department, from the crime scene unit, from the medical examiners. You can actually do the research online. You can kind of find what that optimal temperature is for how to control the inside of a building when there are bodies in there or there's contamination. And the reason I bring that up is, unfortunately, when something happens, it's not like that 1 hour on a Friday night in the crime scene show. It literally takes hours and hours, depending on the number of injuries, the number of bodies, the amount of contamination. It can take several days before bodies are moved. And to the best of their abilities, if the crime scene unit and medical examiner has consideration and help from your team controlling airflow, temperatures, contamination of the space based on different things that might be coming into it, including people, that really helps preserve the scene. And most of our facilities management teams don't train on that. They don't train on, oh, there's a crime scene, now what do we do? And I think that's the biggest piece of it, because the facilities management team gets the challenge of supporting immediately to whatever's gone on and helping the crime scene unit, medical examiner, first responders, as well as being the people who have to come in after they all leave and know where to start and how to assess the situation going forward.
Now, what will the facilities team need to figure out in the days, weeks, and months after a workplace violence incident or just an accident like chemicals leaking or some other event that could result in a crime scene in a facility?
Well, the first challenge is always going to be looking at the scope of the damage assessment. Part of that obviously focuses on temporary response, temporary repairs, and then permanent repairs. And I think the other challenge for facilities management is to also be able to assist with alternate facilities or accommodations for displaced faculty or students, staff, employees, coworkers, vendors. Not all of our facilities, and I've dealt with in a corporate and higher ed, sometimes we have tenants that are part of our facilities, have consideration for what their business practices are and how we accommodate them if they've been in a building or been part of an area that has had an interruption. A facilities management team has to look at a scenario or a situation with a high beam vision on the future. And one of the really good things to consider, unfortunately, I wish we didn't have these examples, but when you look at some of these schools that have experienced traumatic incidents, be it active shooters and deaths and things that have happened, they have to look at the future and realize from a mental health perspective, from an overall, layout, from the visual side, maybe tearing down a building, removing areas, remodeling areas. That's part of what you have to look at from a high beam vision. I know that some of the areas that we've talked about as far as the scene itself and spaces, sometimes those are limited within a certain building. But the challenge becomes when someone walks up and looks at a building or they walk into a building, if that layout stays the same and someone has experienced that trauma, then every time they walk up to that building or every time they walk into that area, they can actually relive that and it becomes a trigger for someone. There's no way to help control that within each person, but part of the thing that a planning team and the long-term vision people have to consider is, what do we need to do long-term to help resolve a situation or make it better? And you'll see that some of these schools and some of these facilities are being either remodeled and or torn down to help deal with the crisis that's happened, the aftermath, and the mental health and trauma for the people who have gone through it, not only the people who were there, but for their families, that second level of trauma that happens, the experience of, I don't want you to have to go back to that building. I don't want, to go back in that building. It could look different if you were the person who was there, or if you were the person who was having to come back to work after your coworker or your teammate or one of your customers or someone was injured in a building. I think the key thing is to remember that flexibility is important. And it's not just the crisis response, it is the business continuity of how do we keep that facility or that critical needs going, the functions that they perform. Can you move those to another building? Can you restore? Do you need to rebuild? Do you need to remodel? And part of the thing is also to make sure that they're being the consideration to not only look internally at what happened for the people that are on that team or in that area, but also look internally to your facility management team, because the response of what they have to deal with, especially if they worked in that building or they knew people in that building, that can also be an issue. So sometimes it's also good to think about what can a vendor do for us versus what our own facility management team and our own internal resources can take care of. We did have that request at a facility where we had some damage. They came back on the facilities management team after they met with their own internal team, said, we didn't plan on this. We didn't realize that our own team was going to be affected by this violence that took place in that building. And they've asked us to not have to go back in that building and be the ones to do the repairs.
Yeah, it's seeing where they worked and potentially people that they worked with. I could completely understand that response, and I could see how facilities teams would have to prepare for that reality.
I think it's normally something that most of us don't deal with. It doesn't really matter whether you're part of the facilities management team or whether you're part of the operations or whether you're on the accounting team. It doesn't, I think the role that we play in our job isn't always the driving factor. I think that behind the scenes, we really have to take a step back and look at the people and look at the person and help support that person in whatever they're being asked to do. Our skills and our knowledge, our abilities, I kind of jokingly say we put those in our little red wagon as we go through life. And the things that we learn to do, we actually pull out of our little red wagon and go, wait, I've experienced that, or I have knowledge of that, or I've trained for that. And I think that's important. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is sometimes the little red wagon can get too full. Sometimes the things that we experience can be traumatic and can stay with us much longer than we realize. I think that one of the things that we've learned as a society right now is to take a step back and consider the mental health responsibilities that we have. Not only do we have to look at it from an overall perspective of response to a situation that's happening, a damage, a workplace issue, I think we also have to look at how do our employees, our staff, our co-workers, even the vendors that come in to take care of stuff, it does take a toll on us whenever we see things over and over again. And I think that we do have to make considerations for what is the best way to handle it, and also really know your people. Take the time to ask the questions, even if you have to sit down in a one-on-one before they respond to whatever the scene is and say, you may have to face these types of things. And we need to ask you if you're going to be okay with that. And people need to know it's okay to say, I'm not okay with that. And from a facilities management team, maybe that means finding some external resources, making sure that you can train with your team internally. A good thing too for facilities management teams is to step back and say, you know what, let's recognize the needs of our own team so that we can respond accordingly and we can support our team in the best way possible.
EJ, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today and for sharing these insights with our audience.
You're very welcome. I think our facilities management teams, they struggle to always have good people and skilled and trained people. And I think it's important to have that. And I think it's important to recognize the strengths that your folks have. Find the experts among your team. Find the people who are really good at what they do and utilize that. Let them make sure that they're training other people, but also do the other thing. Step back and find the people who are supporting behind the scenes that are really good at being support systems, but maybe they're not the person to be the front runner, and recognize that experience and that abilities, because you can't get by without both.
No, you can't. Thank you so much to our audience for listening to today's episode, and stay tuned for the next episode of Facility Resilience.